Hello, and thank y'all so much for joining us today. Today, we are blessed and honored to have Ron Lerma and his team at LGE Consultants present to us on design thinking. A little bit of background on Ron. He's very, very experienced in developing new services, products, and markets, and is a very recognized leader, public speaker, and subject matter expert in sales, negotiation, product, service, innovation, and strategy. Executives seek him because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding, along with the ability to interpret data, explain complicated issues, and solve problems. He's a negotiation consultant for Think Inc., a Chicago based management consulting firm specializing in redefining business negotiation, helping translate ideas into successful outcomes. Advocating visions that drive innovation is a starting point for Ron business acumen. Inspiration and common sense is what executives come to value most in him. He is known for increasing sales with improved negotiation, unprecedented customer acquisition, retention, and satisfaction. Ron served as executive VP at Help on Demand, a technology brokerage firm providing IBM systems responsible for growth in sales. He negotiated ventures while developing sales teams worldwide. His awareness of emerging markets and developing tenacity and grit to lead. Ron holds an associate in science degree from Long Beach and is a graduate of Stanford University's Lead Corporate Innovation Program. He is the founder of the Lead Gig Economy Global Network, hosted at Stanford, made up of seasoned GSB executives offering management consulting to the SMB marketplace, offering public speaking engagements, coaching, sales, negotiation, strategy, design thinking, business modeling, corporate innovation, startup investment, and military innovations. He's experienced in aerospace, healthcare, technology, mechanical systems, and climate change innovations for farms. He is serving as a facility consultant for BMI Mechanical, responsible for growth and sales. Ron is on a mission to help leaders bring feet to their dreams. With over 20 years of experience in education, he brings positive change with street-level strategies that win. And Ron, we are blessed to have the introduction made to us through one of our board of advisor members, Chad Tonko. So thank you so much for making time today for presenting here to the membership. Thank you so much, and please take it away from here.
Well, thank you. I wasn't nervous, but now I am after the introduction. My goodness, I'm not certain what to do about that. But thank you. So I'm happy to be here. It's an absolute privilege to be here today. So, but before I begin, let me share a little bit about LGE Consulting. And as John had mentioned, so we're from Stanford University, executive education program. And it's a program started about 5 years ago, and it's designed to serve executives who seek insight and innovation. And it's called LEAD. So those acronyms mean, learn, engage, accelerate, and disrupt. I'm mostly on the disruption side. And I have the best job ever. I get to work with some of the brightest minds in the industry. And one of those bright minds is Kelly Alvarez. She's a partner at LGE, is a design thinking expert, and it's a real privilege to work with her. But before I hand it over to Kelly, let me frame up the workshop really quickly. So typically this workshop is about 2 days long. But we're going to try to provide as much value as we can in about 60 minutes. But what I found is, not everybody understands the complexity of design thinking, and often, reading a book is not enough to understand and execute the methods. And also I found that the creative value of a problem is not fully understood for the best results. So to illustrate this point, let me tell you about a group of men who use design thinking to save lives. So United States Army Special Operations was called in to provide a ceasefire. So what all wars have in common is the fighting season. So warriors like to fight in the spring and summer because in the winter it's too cold and their tanks get stuck in the mud. So the foreign government, they wanted to stop the fighting. So to do this, the Army called in the design thinkers. So the question was, how do you stop the fighting? So a small sample of what they did was this. Here are the questions. How do the rebels, what do the rebels do during the non-fighting season? And what would motivate them to stop fighting? So here's what they did. Because they discovered all the rebels are not loyal to the cause, and they want to go home to see their families. And Christmas time was the slowest part of their fighting season. So the rebel pathway back to the base camp. So the Army strung up Christmas tree lights and pictures of their families. And they strung this for about 4 miles, lights and pictures. So the result, when the fighting season began in the spring, no one showed up. So they use an empathy approach to solving this problem. With that said, we can learn a little bit more about how some of the methods were used by solving these problems. So with that said, may I introduce Kelly Alvarez. Kelly, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for
You're
that
welcome.
great introduction, and thank you also for the design thinking example. That was a really nice example. Thank you, John, for inviting us to speak. Without further ado, I would like to share my screen and begin the presentation on design thinking. And as Ron mentioned, it's just an overview. We will walk through some practical examples and try to give you as much of a taste of what design thinking is, because it's a very, very hands-on, empathetic approach, which is best done through examples. And so we're going to frame what design thinking really is, and we'll leave. And during the presentation, if anybody has any questions, I think you can use a comments box. John mentioned that you all are very familiar with this process. So I will stop and answer any questions. And at the end, we will also have some time for Q&A. So with that, John, I'd like to present my screen.
Awesome. If you could just go ahead and click screen share one more time and pull it up. Then we can go ahead and share the screen here. And yes, as you mentioned, Kelly, this is going to be very interactive. If someone has a question in the middle of it, please go ahead, drop it in the comments box, and we'll make sure to go ahead and read that off and get the answer, get the question answered for you. But no worries, we will have a Q&A at the end as well. Kelly, you are good to go with your presentation whenever you are ready.
All right, thank you very much. And another thing I wanted to just point out, that during the presentation, when we get to the practical examples, I will request the audience to participate in a poll, so that because the practical examples are going to be interactive, and we're going to decide based on the audience, which way the audience wants to take the story. So I will be posting a link in the comments box, and I'll let you know when I will be posting that link. So it would be great if we can get some audience participation while we do this presentation. All right, so this is a design thinking overview. It is, we've tried to tailor this presentation for small businesses, which is the audience of McGraw Council. I apologize, give me 1 second. I'm going to skip through the introductions. We've already made the introductions. And I'm going to start with a story of Doug Dietz. He was a designer at GE Healthcare. Doug and his team had just delivered this new MRI scanner, which he was extremely proud of. He visited the hospital where the scanner was installed, intending to see the results of their hard work. But instead, he noticed a terrified young girl overcome with anxiety over her impending scan. Doug was drawn to the fact that his fantastic new design had not changed a thing for the patient. He saw that the MRI experience through the eyes of the young girl resembled a journey through a hole in a brick wall, in a dark room with flickering fluorescent lights. This experience was a turning point for Doug. It triggered a personal crisis which forever changed his perspective. He saw a problem that needed to be solved. He just didn't know yet how to solve it. After some deliberation about the situation, with friends and colleagues, and some advice from his boss at GE, Doug attended a design thinking workshop at Stanford, where he learned about human-centered approach to design thinking and innovation. He learned how to reframe the challenge. How could one create a scanner experience that children would love? He knew that redesigning the MRI machine itself was not an option. So he set out to redesign the experience instead. As you can see in these pictures, they stuck decals of different experiences and also gave costumes and scripts to the technicians so that they could be a part of this entire experience. This effort resulted in a very noticeable improvements in patient experience, while at the same time reducing the financial burden and without the added technology enhancements. Patient satisfaction scores went up 90%. Children did not suffer of anxiety anymore. Instead, some of them asked their parents if they could go back the next day. Children now hold still during the procedure, and that in turn prevents the doctors from having to repeat the scans. There is also less need for anesthesiologists, which meant more patients could get scanned each day, and this heavily impacts positively the financial side of the equation. So, bottom line, with design thinking, Doug and his team were able to create a tremendous impact by expanding the scope of the problem from product to experience. Any organization, whether large or small, can adapt this method for either developing new products or services, or changing or upgrading their existing products, services, or operations. With that story as our backdrop, I'd like to spend a few minutes to introduce design thinking at a very high level by revisiting the motivation behind design thinking. Then we'll talk about the design thinking process. We'll introduce a practical application of design thinking by using an interactive storytelling method where you will decide which path to take. And following that, we'll talk about how to incorporate design thinking in your own business. And then at the end, we'll do some Q&A. Okay, let's begin by introducing design thinking. Why design thinking? It goes beyond the problem and into the underlying cause by asking the question why. Traditional problem solving starts with the problem itself. We tend to ask the question, what problem are we solving? And what can I do about it? Most often, when we look at the problem only for what it is, we are most likely seeing it from only one perspective, either our own perspective or the perspective of the person, team, department, or organization that has defined the problem. In design thinking, however, we go beyond the problem and look at the situation, the circumstances. We try to understand through the eyes of the customer why this problem exists. This is necessary even if it is a business problem or an operations problem. It may be a cost optimization problem, which at first glance may have nothing to do with the customer. But by training yourself to always ask the question, why, and look at it through the eyes of the customer, you will likely uncover impacts which you may not have originally considered. It resolves the tension between creativity, practicality, and a fear of the unknown. When you consider an innovation project, you're going to have creative people involved. And if you need to make money from this innovation, you need to have pragmatic, business-minded people in the room as well. Now, if the innovation involves technology, you'll have engineering minds, you'll have project managers, all creating a wonderful tension between creativity, practicality, and a fear of the unknown. Design thinking resolves this tension. By introducing logic and a systematic order to this creative process, you'll see how this order comes about. And the third compelling reason to use design thinking for your innovative initiatives is that it gets around human biases and attachments to behavioral norms that time and again block the exercise of imagination. It beats status quo. How you respond to the statement, "That's how we do things here," may be the only thing that determines the success or failure of a design thinking initiative. This statement must be questioned. It must be challenged. It is a gold mine which will uncover underlying issues you never thought existed. I'd like to acknowledge that in industries that are highly regulated and where strict policies have to be adhered to, status quo must be maintained. However, with careful consideration, you're able to strike the necessary balance and decide when to challenge the status quo and when not to. The important thing is to allow the freedom to challenge anything, and also to be open to a response which requires you to give in to it. The design thinking process. There are 5 stages to any iterative process. It starts with gaining an empathetic understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. We call that stage empathize. Here we get a deeper personal understanding of the issues, and we try to solve it from the perspective of the customer or whoever the beneficiary of your service is.
Can I ask you a quick question, Kelly?
Yes.
When you're talking beneficiary, I think I know the right answer to this one, but again, for the small business owner, is it possible that you're going to have multiple beneficiaries that you need to satisfy?
Absolutely. So, and I think this will, we will talk about this in the examples as well. Especially with a small business owner, you have customers, you have employees, you have other partners that help you in your business. So in the example, we'll see there's a restaurant owner, there's a realtor, there's an accountant, and at any point in time, roles get switched depending on what the problem is. So there's always a beneficiary. It may not always be your customer.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. The next stage in this design thinking process is called the define stage. Here, we analyze observations that we collected during the first empathize and observation phase. And then we synthesize all of the information that we get to define core problems that come up during this process. Again, the core problems that we define are from a human-centered perspective, not the business perspective, the human-centered perspective. We want to be able to move away from problems that sound like we need to increase sales by 20% this year to problems that sound like reduce the amount of time the customer has to wait to be served, for example, in a restaurant. Once we have clearly defined what some of our core problems are, we move into the third phase, which is known as ideation. Here we are inviting a diverse team of people to generate ideas by thinking outside the box. With a solid understanding of the customer's need, and conducting an analysis and synthesis of the problem, this team is now well equipped to think outside the box and generate creative ideas. Here, there are a number of tools and techniques that can be used. Which tools and techniques, however, needs to be decided carefully depending upon the situation. There are also going to be other constraints, like how much time do you have to solve this problem? What's your budget? And what available resources you have to solve this problem? So by taking all of these things into consideration, you select the right tools and techniques, you select the right team, and then you move on to the next phase, which we call prototyping. During this phase, you're producing a number of inexpensive, scaled-down versions of the solution. This is an experimental phase. And the aim is to identify the best possible solution for each of the problems that you defined during the first three phases. The team gets a better understanding of the constraints involved when building these scaled-down versions of the solution. They can also anticipate potential behaviors of the customers when they're building these prototypes. Once a prototype is built, we go down to actually testing the solution and monitor and measure the results from these tests. We do these tests with real customers as much as possible. This is the final stage of this iteration. However, since design thinking is an iterative process, the results obtained from this phase is usually used to redefine or reframe one of the problems that were created that were defined in the earlier phases.
So can I ask a quick question, Kelly?
Yes, please.
When you're talking about redefining the problem there, are we almost going back in the process back to define and replaying it out again? Kind of like a customer journey after you get them in the loyalty loop, so to speak, where you go back?
Yes, absolutely. So this whole design thinking process is iterative. You can the best thing is to start by observing the customer, the situation. But if you're somewhere in between, start wherever you're at, right? And go back to the beginning. Or if you're in the prototype phase and while you discover some constraints, you go back to defining, or you go back sometimes to the observation stage. So you can jump around. The only thing that you need to bear in mind when you're doing this is that at every stage, you must record the results of that stage and then use it in the following, in either the following phases or the following iterations of the process. Does that answer your question, John?
That does perfectly. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. I'd like maybe to pause a few seconds here to see if we have any other questions that might come up.
Anyone has any questions that they'd like to have addressed right now, go ahead and leave a comment either on the Facebook post of this video or the YouTube channel. And then once it's posted, we can go ahead and have them addressed. Otherwise, we'll wait just a few more seconds here. And if nothing comes in, Kelly, we can go ahead and proceed.
Sounds good. All right.
Let's continue moving forward whenever you're ready. Looks like the audience fully understands. That's awesome.
Okay, that sounds perfect. All right, so I will move on to the next slide, which talks about the design thinking mindset. Design thinking is a process, yes, but there are different frameworks that you can use in order to execute and implement this process. But the thing to understand is that it's a mindset. It is iterative, like we just talked about. It starts with the customer and it ends with the customer. It's a human-centered approach to problem solving. It is a collaborative approach. So it is most useful when you're doing this exercise with a team of diverse thinkers. Everybody that can get involved in this process, usually it's nice to keep the team to like about 3 to 5. And if there are too many people, then you can break up problems and do them differently. But it must be collaborative. It should involve different kinds of thinkers so that you can think outside the box. It is about experimentation. So you have to think with the mind of an experimenter. Think small, think big, but do small. And then it's a learning process. So after every step in the phase and after every iteration, you have to make sure that you learn something from the previous iteration. We can now get into a practical application of design thinking, and this is where we're going to do some interactive polls.
And so if these are links, Kelly, please either post them in the comments or send them to me, and I can get them posted for you. Is that the way you'd like to do it?
Yes, that's how I would like it. I'm sorry, John, give me 1 second.
Absolutely.
I am just running into some technical difficulty here.
No rush at all. No rush at all.
Okay. I am trying to get this somehow disappeared on me.
No worries at all.
There we go.
Yeah. Oh, you got it?
Yes, I got it. Thank you.
Perfect. Absolutely.
All right. So we're going to talk about a family-owned restaurant called Harvest. It's one of the local restaurants here, which I love. They serve American fare, and this restaurant is owned by a gentleman named Stan. In this story, we're going to talk about Stan, who is the owner of Harvest. He opened the restaurant 10 years ago, and it has been thriving until, unfortunately, the pandemic hit. We're also going to talk about Tim, who is the realtor who helped Stan buy the restaurant and a few other businesses in the past. They continue to be good friends, in addition to being business colleagues. We'll also talk about Jane, who is Stan's accountant. She's been working with Stan for a couple of years and has been a trustworthy advisor to him. Here's the situation. Bill, who has been a friend of Stan for a while, calls him out of the blue. And Stan picks up the phone and hears his excited voice at the other end. They used to be business school colleagues. He says, Stan, I just met with my advisor, and he tells me that my portfolio is doing so well. He actually thinks I can retire and take that year-long road trip that I've been planning. Stan is, of course, excited for him. But, you know, at the end of the call, after they talk about what's happening, et cetera, he feels not, you know, I mean, he is excited, yeah, but we want to know how exactly Stan feels, depending. We want to know from the audience how you think Stan might feel. So I'm going to post this poll in the chat. I think, John, I have to post it to you.
All righty. I'll go ahead and get this posted in the chat. Bear with me. Here is the poll. It's going up in the comments now.
And I'll leave this on for a little bit because there is a lot to read.
Perfect.
So take your time, and I'll wait to see where the poll is coming in.
Excellent. Fantastic. I'm very curious to see what the poll comes in as well. So typically when you make this presentation, is this being presented to, I guess, who would the typical audience be? Because as we know, when you're taking surveys and such, it can greatly impact the results of the survey.
This is specifically for small business owners.
Even better. Even better. Wait a few more minutes here to get all of the survey responses in.
So right now, we're right about 50-50 at where Stan's worrying about his retirement and where he has taxes to pay. So I think maybe we'll move forward with the cash flow problem.
There we go. This will be a good one.
So he talks to his accountant. Stan is worried about how is he going to pay his bills. He's got taxes coming up. He calls Jane in about a week. He's not quite ready to deal with these issues yet. So in about a week, he calls Jane. He says, "Hi, Jane. It's time to file my taxes. Do you have some time tomorrow to come by?" And then he says, "I would also like to go over my financials. I need to see if I can improve my cash flow." So Jane says, "Sure, I can come over tomorrow. Can you reserve a corner table for me at 11:30? And, she says, "I've been meaning to try out your new menu. We can chat afterwards." So Jane has been monitoring Stan's accounts, and she observes that his profit margins haven't been great. His sales could also do with a boost. Jane wanted to gather some information, though, before going over the financial situation with Stan. So she decides that she's going to go a little early and survey the neighborhood. She observes the restaurant patrons at lunch hour. She goes in at 11:30 when her table was reserved. She has a conversation with Stan. She orders her food, and she plans about a 2-hour lunch because she wants to see what's happening in the restaurant. She notices that the wait for the food was longer than average, than any other average restaurant. But she looks around and sees that the guests are pretty happy. They're not complaining. They've been at the table, they're sitting and having a nice chat. It's lunch hour, the patrons are from businesses around. And they seem happy. Some of the tables have been there an hour and a half. Some have been an hour, but mostly, the turnover she notices is pretty low. So Stan joins her after a 2-hour lunch and says, Jane says, "Stan, I took a look at your books. Your profit margin and sales are not that great, despite the fact that your restaurant seems full. The turnover seems low, and the food, though absolutely delicious, takes a bit long to arrive. If we can get your financials to look better, then we can start planning for your retirement." Stan had never really thought about this before. His customers never complained about the time it took to get food. The ambiance was great, and they enjoyed chatting at the table. So they didn't really care, but he realized this could be hurting his business. So here's another poll. What do we think Stan can do about solving his cash flow problem? And John, I'm going to share another poll.
Perfect.
Let's hope we have a few more responses here.
Posting the link now. Here's the second poll. Just posted and submitted.
Oh, John, I'm sorry, I posted the wrong poll.
Let's go back and we'll go ahead and get that replaced.
Let me stop that one. And let me start the new one. And here's the new one.
Perfect.
Apologize for that.
No worries at all. You're posting the comment. Just submitted it now. Y'all can go ahead, click on the link, cast your vote there. Give it a few more minutes to populate the results, or a few more moments rather.
So here again, we're right up at 50-50 with Stan wanting to look into the problem himself and hiring a consultant. So let's look at what happens if he looks into the problem himself. Stan does some research online, finds an article about design thinking, and he follows a structured approach. Before I move on here, I want to rewind a little bit and revisit the path that Stan took. Initially, he decided that he wanted to solve his cash flow problems. He went to his accountant, Jane, and Jane told him that his cash flow wasn't doing very well, right? I mean, his profits weren't doing very well. So Jane had incidentally heard about design thinking, and she heard about this method of observing the problem, looking at it through the customer's eyes. And for Jane, Stan is her customer, but she recognizes that she's trying to solve Stan's problem. So she wants to see what Stan's customers look like and what Stan's situation is it looks like. And so that's why she did that first phase of design thinking, which was observing Stan's restaurant, his patrons, the neighborhood, and try to assess what was going on in his business. And that's how she came up with the observation that his profits could do a little better if he looks into the problem of long waiting times. And so now, since Stan decides to do some research and learn about design thinking, he also learns that he has to do some observations himself. Now, as Jane pointed out, the problem was long wait times. So he decided that he was going to look into what's happening inside his kitchen. In this case, now he's looking at it from the customer's perspective, but he wants to look at it from his employee's perspective as well. So he closely observes what's happening inside the kitchen. He makes a note of what might be causing delays. And then he goes on to the next phase, which is to share his observations with his team. Together, they define and prioritize the problems. So now here we're looking at the first two steps in design thinking: observation, empathize, and the second phase, which is defining the problem. After they've figured out, a few problems, they observe, they come up with some prototypes and develop a scaled down version of potential solutions to test them. After testing some of those, they realize, after testing some of those ideas, they start to see an increase in dessert sales in some cases. In other cases, people leave as soon as they finish the meal, making space for new patrons. So they know that if they start to implement their solutions on a larger scale, they're going to see some growth in revenue as well as increase in their profits. So how would you implement design thinking in your own business? The first thing you have to do is to stop and consider if design thinking is the right way for you to go. Design thinking is one of many approaches to problem solving. As we talked about before, it is iterative, it's human-centered, it's collaborative, experimental, and it's learning-based. But you need to see first, what kind of problem are you solving? Are you solving a business problem, or are you solving a customer problem? Are you solving a strategic or a tactical problem? Is it a return on capital invested problem? Is it a growth problem? Or is it a cash flow problem? Does this problem need a design thinking approach? And lastly, are you fully prepared for a design thinking approach? To go back a little bit, we talked earlier about the fact that you have to be prepared to allow creative input into the whole problem solving process. You have to allow yourself to think from the customer's perspective. And so you have to commit to this design thinking approach if you start it. Otherwise, you may not see good results that come out of it. And if all these things check out, you're all set to go. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Well, I've got one right off the bat. Could you, I think it really helps a small business owner when there's like a definitive example. Can you give like an example of when a small business should implement design thinking and when design thinking might not be the right thing for them?
So design thinking is the right solution when you have a problem that involves the humans in your organization. And most often you'll see that any problem that you have in your organization or your small business is going to affect either an employee or a customer, right? Even if it is your bottom line, even if, as we saw in this example that we just ran through, Stan in his restaurant, he had this conversation with Bill. He's thinking about his retirement, but retirement's not coming up so soon. He has more current issues to face. He has a cash flow problem. He doesn't know how he's going to meet his bill, so he wants to talk to his accountant. So that's a classic example, right, of what you can do, of how you can use design thinking. The issue is with the mindset. If you don't have the design thinking mindset, if you don't have the mindset of involving your employees, if you don't have the mindset of sitting and observing your customers, or involving anybody outside of your normal operations to give you some ideas on how to solve these problems. If you're not open to testing out some new ways of doing things, then design thinking might not be the right approach. Does that answer your question?
That does. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. And to add to that, John, we have one customer who makes bottles, plastic bottles. They make plastic bottles for the medical business. And so there was one older woman, 85 years old, has arthritis, and she needs to take her meds, but she can't open the bottle because it hurts her. And so it became a big problem with her family called in to the company and said, look, you need to fix this. And so what ended up happening is they ended up, you may have seen these bottles at the pharmacy now, they have a larger cap on it.
Yep.
That was a design thinking process. So the manufacturer would sell to the pharma company. When the pharma company said, we're not selling enough meds, and the problem is because you can't open up the bottle. And so the alternative was Judith is going to go somewhere else to buy this. So in that case, the problem became much more complex. How do you change that whole supply chain to change the size of the bottle for Judith? It turns out that there's thousands of people just like her that need to take her meds, but they have difficulty opening that bottle. They didn't know that until they did design thinking.
Right. And I think you also really touched on a big point there, because it's one of those small business things. They look at their financials, they look at their business, they're like, number one problem is we got to increase sales. Well, yes, but what's the trigger for it? Do we need the product enhancement? Do we need the service enhancement? Are we doing something internally wrong? In that, in that case, it was the cover of the bottle. In the restaurant case, people were staying at the chair at that table, and they weren't purchasing enough for the amount of time that they were in. It was a little more of an internal process issue. And I think that's where a lot of small business owners can apply something like design thinking. Take a step back and say, what is stopping me from growing my business? What's stopping me or slowing me from growing my revenue? Because very often it's not exactly a marketing issue or lack of referrals or word of mouth, depending upon the industry, but there's often something internal that limits their capacity.
Yeah, I would also add to that when I first was introduced to design thinking years ago, I didn't know anything about anything. I was pretty sloppy with it. And I was the guy who would read a book and say, I know how to do this. And so I would try to do it, and then it would just fail. I'm like, what the heck? I'm more about the big picture. Let's get things scaled up. And I'm not too much into the details. But some of the design thinking methodologies forces you to get into those details, but more to the point, when you have a visionary and an accountant into the room trying to solve a problem, that used to irritate me. But now that is the solution to bring about good design thinking, because I have difficulty thinking like an accountant, and the accountant has difficulty with the vision of let's go to the moon. And so design thinking became the perfect medicine for small businesses. I mean, running a small business is like swimming in molasses. You're just trying to keep afloat, and to solve a problem, they're like, what the heck? I go to this design thinking, I just want to solve this, what do I do next? So I found the solution, especially with complex problems, everything's connected to supply chains and, ROIs and net present values. It gets complicated quickly.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I have two more questions here. One's pretty straightforward, I think. Is it an oversimplification to say that design thinking is basically thinking strategically then applying tactically?
That's a great question. Callie, would you like to answer it?
Sure. So design thinking is just one way to solve a problem, right? Thinking strategically and applying tactics is what you end up doing when you're doing design thinking. But everything in between, design thinking is really how you move from the strategy to the tactics. Because in the process of doing so, if you're just thinking business problem, right? I need to increase my sales. You can think all kinds of tactics that you can apply. How are you going to choose the right tactic? And how you choose the right tactic, if you choose that tactic with the customer in mind, with using empathy, using observation, that's what will lead you to the most what's the word I'm looking for? To the tactic that will bring you the best results in the shortest amount of time. So I think that's the difference between just moving from strategy to tactics to the way in which you do that and how you prioritize it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes it very linear and straightforward. And I guess in that light, my last question would be, even though this is a 2-day workshop, y'all really condensed it. Thank you so much for fitting it in 45 minutes. It's really impressive because you can see all the different tangents this can go off on. But for the small business with fewer than 20 employees, For something as important and complex as design thinking, what are maybe 2 or 3 things that they need to do today to start implementing the knowledge that you just shared, to start evaluating if design thinking is good for them, or if they know it is right off the bat? How do they kind of start? What are 2 or 3 things they need to do today with the information that you just shared?
Yeah, Kelly, can I speak to that? And then
yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
So again, the first thing that comes to mind is create an observation team that is not like you. Bring the accountant in, bring the designer in, and just observe the problem. And I found that to be really effective, and it's a really great start. And make certain you go to a really great restaurant as well, with the best bottle of wine. Then you're good.
There you go. It's a solid way to solve problems.
That's right. That's right. Kelly, go ahead.
And to go a little beyond just looking at the problem, make sure you identify who the person who is impacted, which group of people are impacted most by that problem, because then you start to bring the human element into it, and look at it from the perspective of the human that's involved. So whether it is the customer or an employee. There's another example that I had come across where in a restaurant example as well, that the employees, the kitchen staff were really unhappy. They were like demotivated, and the owner didn't know what was going on. When he went behind the scenes, he realized that it was just the kitchen environment that was uncomfortable. Their uniforms were uncomfortable. So that's all that he needed to do, was to get them a more comfortable set of uniforms. Make sure that the environment in which they were cooking the food was more comfortable for them. But for that, he had to go in behind the scenes and understand and look at what was going on, hear the conversations, not just stay in the operations. So observe the problem, but try as much as possible to look at it from the customer's perspective. The second thing I would say, make sure you have a diverse team. Like Ron mentioned before, bring the accountant in, bring the designer in, bring a customer in. And then the third thing is test whatever it is that you think is the problem before investing large scale into what the solution is.
I think that's a really good one. Very applicable. A small business owner very often has a good gut instinct, and they typically, for the most part, they trust it. And most of the time, it's going to be correct. However, when you're talking a significant investment, you don't want to be leaning on your gut too much for that. You want to get the data that you can. You want to identify the hypothesis, then you want to test it on a small scale, because the worst thing you can do is start committing cash to a massive investment, only to find 25% through that you're committed to the whole thing, and it's not going to even solve the problem the way that you want it to. So I think that follow-up testing component is a hugely important dynamic there. That is really, really applicable. I don't see any other questions in the comments. Before we wrap up, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. Otherwise, Ron and Kelly, would you have any other conclusions or closing insights to that fantastic presentation?
I think that's it. I think we've, at the high level at least, covered. The only other thing I would say is, when you're doing the ideation sessions, there are a lot of tools. There's brainstorming, there's things like brainwriting, but as I mentioned in the presentation itself, you have to pick the right one depending on the situation. So lots of tools and technologies that exist out there. Look through it and see what the best one might be to apply to your situation.
Yeah, and John, on my side of the ledger, I just want to thank you for the great work that you're doing with small SMBs. The pandemic has taken small, medium businesses and put them on their head. And the work that you're doing and allowing education and whatever we can do, to help them. I think the last analysis, there's over 20 million small businesses that support our economy, and some of them are struggling. And we're happy to be part of that solution. So thank you so much for having us. It's been a privilege.
I cannot thank
you. I echo that as well. Thank you very much.
I cannot thank you both enough for taking time out of your day. I know you guys run tight schedules. You run very productive schedules. Thank you so much for taking the time to present to people here so that they can get this information literally at no cost. They can understand one of the new trends in business, a methodology that drives business forward. Again, that for the most important part for the small business, it's applicable. It's something that they can identify and see if it makes sense for them. So Ron and Kelly, thank you so much. Y'all stay safe, stay blessed, and I look forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you,
Thank you, John.
Sean. You as well.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.